So, having been away on a break for several months, let's just say that I was defunct for some time, but now I'm refunct, crawling back into the primordial ooze of Nigerian politics and joining many others in assessing whether democracy is deepening or whether this country is lurching towards more catastrophic disruptions. In the latest twist, President Tinubu treading a cautious but successful path in the first ruling of the Presidential Election Petitions Tribunal, but with an appeal still hanging over his presidency. Of course, if that appeal also goes his way, then his destiny would truly have arrived. But in a country facing a cost of living crisis, strikes, problems in public services and never-ending political drama, the president has many other things to worry about. And as he marks his first 100 days in office, his job, and that of anyone who becomes president, would be certainly made much easier if they didn't also have to worry about whether they'll remain in office whilst the legal process of consolidating their position drags on. Should we be looking at concluding the process of electoral petitions and challenges well before the inauguration? Or is that likely to become another sensitive political issue that shouldn't be touched with a barge pole? Well, for more on this, I'm delighted that I'm joined now in the studio by the spokesman of the influential Northern Elders Forum, Dr. Hakeem Baba Ahmed. Great to see you. And I must remind our viewers that you actually used to be with INEC at some point, a long time ago. So you've got that inside track, which is what we're hoping we can exploit this evening. But thank you very much indeed, and lovely to see you. Very honored to have you here.
Thank you very much. I notice you've rested.
Well,
good to see you.
Yeah, but the minute you start again, you
lose all of it.
Everything just sort of goes topsy-turvy, doesn't it? But
thank you for the invitation.
Well, thank you very much for coming in and honouring that invitation. So as we await, as we said at the outset, the next political blockbuster in Nigeria, which will come from the Supreme Court within the next 60 days or so, how satisfied are you with this process so far? Perhaps I should say, how satisfied is the Northern Elders Forum for whom you speak?
Well, we are satisfied that Nigerians have allowed the constitutional process to go unhindered. We've always made a case for Nigerians to respect constitutionalism. We've always championed free and fair election. We've always championed respect for the law, and we watch the tribunals and the judgment of the tribunals very closely. We are happy that the event wasn't followed by any trauma for the nation. We have enough problems as it is on
Absolutely.
the table. But we are also happy that so many issues have been thrown up that we are hoping can be taken away from what the PEPT said and what the Supreme Court is likely to say, and they would feed and improve our electoral process. This is principally one of the major benefits of rulings. The judicial process, as you are aware, is part of the electoral process now, and what the judicial process finds out and says and decides is a key element of the process of improving the electoral process. And we must pay very, very close attention to what they say was said correctly, what was said wrong, what is upheld, what is rejected. Those things are very, very important.
And your sense was that it was all sort of shipshape and seaworthy?
Well, I saw a number of things. I saw a tribunal which, to be perfectly honest with you, I think rose to the occasion. I don't want my comments to be interpreted as a commendation, as a commendation of the judgment. We will leave that to the Supreme Court, as you said in your introduction. But I saw a tribunal that defended its judgment with vigor, with courage, and with what appears to be maybe even a slightly unexpected level what the Americans would say, Oomph. They
There was
came
a kick
out.
to it, was it?
Yes. So I saw that. I also saw the manner in which a lot of the things that we took for granted, the sort of things that the politicians and the lawyers and the foot soldiers thought were going to decide this judgment, we saw them analyzed and judged on in a manner that I think substantially puts them to rest. They've recurred over and over and over again. But in those 12 hours of the judgment of the PEPT, those issues were thoroughly dealt with. They should go to the Supreme Court. We support their going to the Supreme Court. The parties going to the Supreme Court. We support them, and we hope that the Supreme Court will do justice to the cases.
But I mean, you're a very good analyst. I mean, not just of Nigerian political affairs, but also of electoral issues, legal questions, and so on. And I mean, there seems to be the sense that the Petitions Tribunal was obviously keen to give the impression that its focus was entirely on the legal arguments. But there are political arguments and considerations as well, aren't there?
I don't know where you draw the line between the legal and the political when it comes to an election tribunal. An election tribunal basically looks at the evidence before it, looks at the arguments before it, looks at the pleadings before it, and makes a judgment. What is before them is the credibility and the quality of an election. Pleadings are made, lawyers counter each other, and so what is decided on is who is right and who is wrong. That's basically what we saw. As far as the PEPT was concerned, an election was being interrogated by a lot of parties. There was a lot of passion. But it's also important to recognize the fact that all this was taking place in the context of a tremendous amount of influence and noise coming from the social media, coming from the media and the mainstream media, coming from virtually everybody. There were millions of Nigerians who have made up their minds who has won this election the very day it was announced. And absolutely nothing would change their minds. There were some Nigerians who were willing to see whether the judiciary will rise to the occasion, how they respond to the cynicism of Nigerians, whether they thought these guys would take a lot of money and offer a judgment in favor of one party or the other. And there were the politicians themselves. The fact that they must have paid huge amounts of money to these very expensive lawyers. They expected the judgments to go in their favor as well. This is the thing about elections. Every election is like this. And the differences are in the details. But the truth about it is that this is what we witness. It was basically what the election is. It's a legal thing. An election is a political process. Judgments are legal. The context is politicized. But Nigerians are used to this. I wish it isn't. I'm being honest with you. I wish we didn't spend so much time, so much energy, so much money. Pretty much about 70% of our elected people are decided by the courts. Can you believe this? 70% of the people who become president and governors and I decided no.
Well, I'm going to come to the issue of electoral reform, which is obviously very critical, and your assessment, obviously something that would be greatly prized. But what happens if the Supreme Court decides for President Tinubu? Obviously, the fury of the battle will to some extent subside or be forced to subside, but the perception, as you suggested, opposition perception that a grave injustice has been done will persist above, if you like, the clamour of the victorious. What should happen then? Would that be the best time to look at all the issues that have been raised, some of which you've raised here, not just by the decision of the judiciary, but the conduct of the election itself and the entire process around it?
Yeah, I think that first, yes, we should wait for what the Supreme Court says. Two, what the Supreme Court says should be final, as far as the elections are concerned. 3, there will always be people who will not be happy, always. The only election since 1999 that I know was conducted, results announced, and the next day everybody moved on, was in 2015. A few things happened perhaps behind the scene, but basically you had a sitting president who was defeated. He had called his contestant and said, congratulations, you've won. Called his small circle and says, let's give up, guys. This is it. Calls his party and says, as far as I'm concerned, we've lost an election, which is great. And we moved on. The lawyers lost a lot of money. We didn't have a lot of noise making. It was clear. If we can have elections that are that clear in terms of votes cast and politicians willing to concede, and it would be great. Nigeria's democracy would have grown far beyond anything else that we've done. Because look, we're locked into this democratic process. Getting out of it, it's not even an option. And if you cannot grow from experience and from being tested, then how else does it improve?
I mean, you worked with INEC at one point.
I was the secretary of INEC in 2003. We conducted the 2003 elections.
Yeah. Well, that doesn't speak very well of what you guys did, because a lot of people have a lot of problems with that election.
A lot of people have a lot of problems with every election. I mean, look, elections
how would you compare that? Would you say that there have been dramatic improvements since that time, or is it pretty much more of the same?
I would. We did a number of good things. We were the first INEC to actually create an electronic voters roll, an electronic voters register. Before us, they used to just write down names of voters, and you can vote anywhere like 10, 15, 20, 200 times. But we computerized it, and it was a tremendous improvement. 2, we were the only we conducted the only election that succeeded in getting 42% turnout. Since then, it's been lowering and going down and going down. 42% of the registered voters.
But having had that inside track, I mean, how much political pressure were you under from the government of the day?
A lot. But we also had an excellent INEC. I can tell you that. A few of them are alive. Many have died. But I was amazed at the quality of the people who actually composed the INEC at the time. Look, in 1998, you remember, Charles, the military had boxed itself into a corner. They were desperate to get up. And they had decided within 9 months to organize a political process, organize an electoral process, organize a handover process, and get out of power. 9 months. One of the good things they did was to go out and look for Nigerians of unimpeachable integrity. I was sent to INEC as a permanent secretary because the law then required the secretary of INEC to be appointed by the president, but he or she had to be a serving permanent secretary. And I was deployed there a few months before the elections. And I met this incredibly trustworthy set of Nigerians. I mean, you couldn't possibly buy them. You couldn't possibly influence them at all. These were people who had paid their dues to the nation. Their names were at stake, their reputations were at stake. So I was very fortunate. And they also allowed me huge scope, defined by the Electoral Act, over what the secretary could do or not. So we conducted an election in 2003, and many good things happened, a few bad things happened. They will always happen in Nigeria. But I can tell you one of the things that we did. We went as far as actually disowning our own elections in some instances. And it had never been done since then. INEC, it doesn't matter who is who in who, but INEC could be joined if it is an election issue. We conducted an election in Anambra State. It was so badly done that we literally disowned our own election. What we did was to tell our lawyer, simply don't contest this election. It was so badly done. This was the famous
And who did you blame for it being badly done? I mean, did you blame yourselves? For
No. Well, to the degree that we appointed the returning officers, yes, we were guilty because we appoint returning officers. But we ran, as particularly in a number of states, the blame substantially went to us for misjudgment. It went to politicians who were absolutely bent on rigging the election, and they did. And subsequently, the courts overturned a huge number of the elections that took place in 2003. We returned the sitting president, who was President Obasanjo, if you remember. But there were a number of things that people thought would happen that didn't happen. For instance, many people thought PDP must win Lagos, they must win Kano, they must win Borno, they must win Sokoto, and they must win one or two other states if they were going to survive. And guess what? They lost all those states.
But
and still won the election. So in many ways, the 2003 elections were just another Nigerian election. But we learned a huge amount of things. But the elections today are a completely different kettle of fish. The technology has changed. The systems.
You mean the technology that isn't being deployed, in spite of promises made that they would be deployed, or it would be deployed?
The technology regarding many things.
So in theory, you're saying that there's provision for technology, and you mentioned the electoral act.
Yeah, the electoral act has changed tremendously.
Right, but do you think that the current electoral act, which you think has evolved obviously over the years, do you think it's fit for purpose, that Nigeria's electoral laws are fit for purpose given what we've seen, or do you think they should be rejigged and it should be a continuous process of rejigging?
Let me tell you the truth. I'm a student of politics. It doesn't matter how good your electoral process is. It doesn't matter how credible your election act is. If the political context in which elections take place make it impossible to have a free and fair election, you're going to have a hell of a time conducting a free and fair election.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That is the truth. The Nigerian politician hasn't changed.
And that's the real problem, isn't it?
We've improved the electoral act over and over. In 2019, I mean, I worked in the Senate at a time when the electoral act went through tremendous amount of changes. We sent God knows how many times to President Buhari then, new drafts and changes about that are regarding the electoral act. Everybody said, change this, and we did, and he returned them, every single one of them. So if the Nigerian politician is unwilling to change, he believes he's being rigged, he believes he has to rig, he believes that officials must be bribed, officials believe they have to be bribed. The public believes that the only person who is in election is the guy who spends the most money. How else do you have a credible election in this context? So that's the truth. You need to change. The changes need to go beyond the electoral process. They have to be part of the part of the political process has to change. But our politicians aren't changing. And what is even more worrying is that it's getting worse.
Right, but what about, I mean, let's talk about INEC briefly, because, I mean, you were there. What about INEC and the way it conducts the elections, the partial use of technology, for example, and what many people saw as the almost reluctance to properly apply it to make the process more transparent? I mean, from what you see arising from the tribunal's ruling, does it seem like their judgment strengthened the hand of INEC to do as it pleases?
Let me tell you my personal view. I think that if INEC is guilty of anything in this particular election, it was guilty of over-promising. The difference between...
In line with the requirements of the Electoral Act,
the Electoral Act gives INEC the powers to decide how to conduct an election. That's a settled issue. Of course, it's not entirely settled yet until we hear what the Supreme Court says.
Absolutely.
But the PEPT substantially made that point. I think people got the idea that the law said INEC must conduct an electronic voting system. It didn't. The law didn't do that, but INEC came close to saying we're going to conduct an election that is virtually be an electronic voting system.
Well, what they said was clear. I mean, they said it over and over.
I know, that's what I'm saying. They were guilty
You're saying
of
they came
over-promising.
close. I mean, they were very forthright, and people have a right to hold them
And
to what
that's
they
wrong.
say.
And that's wrong. I think this, if they did anything wrong that I know of, that right off the cuff, I would say to you, don't promise what you won't deliver. They came close to giving Nigerians the impression that we're going to have an electronic, a direct transmission of electronic. Now, those are not just words. They really do mean something in real terms. It means that what the voter decides in the remote village in Yobe State goes straight to one place here in Abuja. It might go to one or two other places just for safety, but basically it's registered his or her vote automatically. That's basically what it is. And in 2023, when we were toying around with this, we visited 11 countries.
You mean 2003?
2003.
Yeah.
We visited 11 countries. Countries that are similar to Nigeria in a number of ways. Large population, large terrain, difficult terrain, topography, challenges, complexities. And we saw what electronic transmission was. Fantastic. Really, really fantastic. It's the same thing. That's what they do in the US in many ways. But the US allows a huge amount of flexibility. States choose what type of election they would have. So you either have one vote, one type of election, and the electronic voting system is one of them. And we came back and said, if we had time, this is what we'll do. But President Yar'Adua, and this is why we should revisit the OS report. President Yar'Adua came to power out of his 7-point agenda, if you remember. One of them was to reform the electoral process. And when he promised, when he was working on his draft speech, Nigerians need to know this. He included reference to the fact that the elections that brought him to power showed evidences of falling below expectations, either legal or whatever. And if I tell you the story, on the night of the elections, of his inauguration, the resistance he faced was frightening. Politicians, his own party's people, Nigerians, people who actually worked for his success, went to him and said, who the hell do you think you are? To say that the election that brought you to power was flawed. Do you realize that you can actually lay the ground for electoral legal challenge? Do you even know how you got elected? Where do you think you got the money from? It was really bad.
Right.
So it's INEC, I think, overpromised and underdelivered on the basis of that promise. They operated within what the law said.
Right.
But I think that people expected that the technology and the system they adopted was going to be faultless. Right. You don't have a faultless electoral system.
Well, on that note, I mean, I could talk to you forever. Fascinating, and your range of experience is just so impressive. I want to thank you very much indeed for coming in. Dr. Hakeem Baba Ahmed is the spokesman of the influential Northern Elders Forum. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.